If reality were to be purely fixed to one specific set of rules, let's say logic, such that it didn't include any contradictions whatsoever, no square circles, no cases in which 2 plus 2 equals anything other than 4, would reality be unlimited, and would it be capable of including anything and everything? Of course not, you would say. Well, what if I were to say that that is possible? You would respond, nonsense. It's not possible. Well, watch the rest of this video. You'll be astounded. So basically throughout all the videos, or most of the videos on this channel so far, I've been giving you a more expansive perspective, showing you how much we can unconstrain ourselves, unconstrain ourselves from the laws of physics, laws of biology, the laws of logic, even infinity itself, and all sorts of semantics, right? Even the English language, all that. So it's been more expansive, but in this video, we're going to get more contracted. I'm going to show you how reality is capable of being just as contractive as it is expansive. Again, using the lens of my condition, just speaking about insights that I have through this condition of mine, and if reality is reflective of my condition in any sense, to any degree, then reality is capable of being contractive in these extreme ways, just as it'd be capable of being radically expansive in the ways that I've detailed throughout all my videos. So let's start with an initial question like that. Let's just say reality were purely logical, and I mean like it completely conformed to classical logic. Obviously on this channel I've showed you how reality is sort of common sense and contradictory at the same time, right? It sort of fuses the line between common sense and contradiction such that it's purely logical and coherent and yet entirely illogical and irrational. Kind of like that video where I used the analogy of the point, right? Like it's just a single point. That point, like for reality to be that point, it's so effortless and so coherent that like it's more logical than any form of logic, right? Like there's nothing contradictory or incoherent about just being that point. And yet, as logical and coherent and consistent as that effortless point is, that point can be any shape, it can come in any number, not just one point, it can be many points, right? Because one point is equivalent to many points, because you stack all the many points and it's just equivalent to having one there or none there, right? You can even have no points, so it can be there so effortlessly that it doesn't even need to be there. So we got all that illogic and all that irrationality from a purely rational point. That is how reality can be purely logical and yet include all this illogical stuff. So we could call that like trivial logic or something like that, right? Like a logic that is unconstrained even from logic itself, such that it can be purely logical and yet transcend logic and include all this contradictory stuff like being one and many and none all at the same time. But no, I'm talking something even more radical in this video here. I'm not just talking about trivial logic. I'm saying picture if reality were completely constrained to classical logic. So like the law of identity, everything being itself, or the law of non-contradiction, there's no such thing as a scenario in which 4 equals 5, or the law of excluded middle, everything is either true or false. There's nothing that's both true and false, nothing that's neither true nor false. Just picture if all 3 of those axioms of classical logic were fixed universal rules that were true across all of reality. So all of reality is constrained to these 3 axioms of classical logic. So reality in our thought experiment here, it's not just trivially logical, it is classically logical, just purely classically rational. Just basically what people think of rationality as being, it completely conforms to that very human sense of rationality. So in this reality, there is no such thing as square circles. There's no such thing as scenarios in which 2 plus 2 equals 5. No, it always equals 4. There's no case in which it equals anything other than 4. Okay, if reality were this way, if it were purely classically logical, would it be unlimited? Would it include anything and everything if it was completely conformed to classical rationality in this manner? You'd be like, hell no, obviously not. Ethan, you just named things that it does not include. 1, you said it does not include square circles. 2, you said it does not include scenarios in which 2 plus 2 equals anything other than 4. So Ethan, of course it's limited. It is not at all unlimited, and it certainly, therefore, does not include anything and everything. Okay, well, this will be a bit of a brain twister, so we need to start somewhere else first and work our way up. Let's look at this picture here. So you have these 2 buttons, right? One is saying that what the other is saying is false, and then the other is referring back to the first, saying it's true. Okay, so notice something. Don't focus on what the buttons say first. Just look at the picture. Look at the setup. Okay, we have 2 buttons. There's nothing illogical or irrational about the number 2. It's a perfectly rational, coherent number. And we just have 2 buttons. It's not like we have 2 buttons and 1 button at the same time. So there's nothing illogical going on. We have a purely logical setup here. Just 2 buttons side by side. Nothing contradictory at all. And likewise, we have 2 perfectly rational sentences on each of these buttons, right? So there's nothing contradictory with regards to what's written on the buttons. So this entire setup through and through, it's purely logical, purely rational, purely consistent. There's no contradictions in this picture here. There's no square circles. There's no 4 equaling 5. It's a purely rational setup. Yet, look what we get with this setup. We get what's known as the liar's paradox, or basically like, a form of it. Basically, one button saying that the other button is true, and then that button saying the other button is false. So this puts us in a cycle where it's like, okay, if one button says what the other button is saying is true, well, then we defer to that button, which says the other one, what it's saying is false, which means what it's saying is not true, which means what it's saying is true because the other button was saying it's false. Like, you see how it just goes round and round in a circle. We get this contradiction where we cannot really say whether what each button is saying is true or false. Do we say they're both true and false, or neither true nor false? So notice we get an inconsistency in that we get a cyclical contradiction from a purely consistent, uncontradictory setup. The setup of just having the 2 buttons and the 2 sentences, like the entire setup, it's not illogical at all. And yet from the setup, we get something which is purely illogical. We get this paradox, this cyclical contradiction where we cannot really say that each sentence is true or false. We kind of have to say they're both or neither, or both and neither. Okay, so picture if there were a universe that were structured in this way. Picture if there was a universe that had a perfectly rational, consistent, uncontradictory setup in the same way that those 2 buttons being set side by side was a perfectly rational setup. And yet, picture that it had a perfectly rational setup which bred all sorts of contradictions. So the universe and its entire setup, just through and through, would be completely uncontradictory and yet would include all sorts of contradictions. But see, it would include all sorts of contradictions without including any contradictions at all, because again, the entire setup through and through is uncontradictory. So the universe would include no contradictions at all. No contradictions. There would be no square circles, no cases in which 4 equals anything other than 4. It would just be purely rational through and through, no contradictions, and yet it would have contradictions, just like the setup of this liar paradox. Everything about it through and through is uncontradictory. There's no contradictions in it, and yet the setup breeds contradictions. So basically what this shows you is that we can get contradictions without having contradictions at all. And I don't just mean that we start without contradictions. I mean the entire setup all the way through and through does not have any contradictions in it, and yet, despite never having any contradictions, it breeds contradictions. So it includes contradictions without including any contradictions. Now, of course, it's going to be hard to imagine a universe that is set up like these 2 buttons where it's somehow like a perfectly rational setup and yet includes irrational things, even though it doesn't. But I'm just using that as a visual analogy since I don't have anything else to show you from my condition or my experience in terms of what such universes would look like. But the point you should take away from this is that it's possible for a universe or even reality as a whole to be entirely rational, such that it includes no irrational things whatsoever, and yet the entire rational setup, despite being rational through and through, without any irrationality, still includes irrational things, and therefore it can still be unlimited despite being limited to rationality. So, defer back to our earlier question, would it be possible for reality to be unlimited if it were fixed and constrained to the laws of classical logic? Of course, you would think, well, no, it would by definition be limited to those classical logical laws. Therefore, it would not be unlimited. It would not be capable of including anything and everything, because to include anything and everything, it has to include irrational stuff. Okay, well, we can include irrational stuff without including any irrational stuff at all. We can be purely logical and still have irrationality. So we can be fixed and limited to classical logic and still have all sorts of illogical stuff, thereby still being unlimited, even though we are limited to classical logic. If you want to rephrase this in another way, we are basically excluding irrational stuff by not having any contradictions at all, and yet despite excluding it, we are still being unlimited and fully inclusive of all things, because we can still include irrational stuff. So yes, it is possible for reality to be limited to classical logic, such that there are no square circles, there are no cases in which 2 + 2 = anything other than 4. It's just purely logical through and through, and yet reality is unlimited. It includes anything and everything. Another way to help you picture this is, think of it this way. For reality to be unlimited, we could say like that would mean for it to be infinite, right? Okay, well, a square circle, that's a contradiction. What else is a contradiction? Well, going beyond limitlessness or going beyond infinity, that's a contradiction, right? So wouldn't that mean that square circles are equivalent to beyond infinity rather than infinity? In other words, wouldn't you only need square circles to exist if you wanted reality to be beyond infinite rather than merely infinite, right? Like, couldn't you get away with excluding square circles if you only wanted reality to be infinite? Because see, okay, do you really need to include square circles for that? Well, square circles are contradictions. Infinity, at least intuitively, is not a contradiction, right? Like, it's a very rational notion. You kind of just keep going on and on and on forever. Like, think if space were to just go on and on and on forever. Like, there's nothing really illogical about that, right? Like, it's very intuitive. It's very logical to just picture space going on and on and on and on forever. So there's nothing inherently contradictory about the concept of infinity, at least not at the outset. So if infinity is that logical, does it really need to include illogical stuff like square circles in order to be infinite and unlimited? Well, not necessarily, right? Like, I mean, if you wanted it to be beyond infinite, right? Like, if you wanted reality to be beyond infinite and sort of contradictory in that fashion, then yeah, okay, then you could say you need contradictory stuff like square circles. So that's just an intuitive example that maybe gives you another frame on how something could work like that, on how something could be unlimited without including contradictions, right? You would need contradictions in order to get another contradiction, such as reality being beyond infinite, but infinity on its own is not really contradictory, so you don't really need square circles. So infinity is capable of being unlimited while being purely logical and not including square circles. Yet, picture if space did go on and on and on forever, such that it was like this purely logical infinity. Well, if it's truly infinite, such that it is not contradictory and does not include square circles, you could still picture that eventually there's going to be some region of space in which there are square circles, even though it's this purely logical space in which it just goes on forever and never has a need for square circles. So it's like it has no need for square circles because there's nothing contradictory about this notion of infinite space, and yet despite not having any need for them, the fact that it goes on forever means that at some point you'd reach a region where there would be square circles, at least if it's an infinite space that defies, all sorts of other constraints like physics and all that. So this might be confusing. Hopefully it's not too confusing. I will come back to this in a future video, but the point I'm trying to get you to see here is that just as reality can be expansive and limitless and burst through all these constraints, it's also capable of being highly contractive. Not just expansive, but contractive. It is capable of not just including anything and everything, like the sort of anythingness that I talk about with regards to my condition here on this channel. That's a sort of expansive teaching, but what I'm telling you here is that reality is capable of being highly efficient. It's capable of space saving to a high degree, right? Like, it's capable of being so sufficient that it can include anything and everything even without including anything and everything. Like, it can be fixed to one specific system such as classical logic, and yet despite fixing itself to that specific system, it can still include anything and everything. It essentially can be limited yet still be unlimited at the same time, right? Purely rational and yet somehow still unbounded and unlimited, despite the fact that it's limited to logic, right? So you can sort of think of logic as like an unlimiter, like it's limiting it, but by limiting it to logic, it's not limiting it at all, right? So it's space saving. It's kind of like, if you want an analogy, think of a computer program which could run all sorts of high-powered software without using that much power or data at all, right? Like, it's highly efficient. So if reality were absolutely boundless, it wouldn't just be boundless in a sort of expansive sense. It would also be boundless in terms of how efficient it can be. That's where it's not just expansive, but also contractive, right? It can highly limit itself to such a small, narrow program like classical logic, and yet be so efficient within that narrow program that it can still be unlimited and include anything and everything, even though it's fixed into that narrow framework. So it's not using much power, yet it's getting a lot done, right? More bang for its buck, so to speak. It's not spending much effort or power, and yet it's still getting anything and everything done, like a high-powered computer program, if you like that analogy. But that's what it means for reality to be contractive in that sense. But see, our example here of imagining reality being fixed to classical logic, that one makes more sense as a teaching, to say like, okay, reality is logical, but by being logical, it's actually not limiting itself, because by being limited to logic, that actually allows it to just go on forever and include things which are illogical. So saying that reality is logical makes sense if you want to say that reality is unlimited, or at least if you still want to say that, right? People would say that's highly dualistic. Like, well, wait a minute. If reality were just logical, that would create a duality. That would create a distinction in which only logical stuff exists and nothing else exists. Well, right, yeah, it is highly dualistic, but that's the point, is that reality can be so contractive that it can exist as a purely dualistic, highly distinctive thing and yet still somehow be unlimited. Essentially, it can be dualistic and yet be non-dualistic at the same time. It can be totally non-dualistic even as it's being highly fractured and dualistic. Think about that. It can be highly fractured and dualistic, and yet in that highly fractured duality, it can be totally all-inclusive and totally non-dualistic. You see? Again, like that liar's paradox setup with the two buttons. It can be a purely rational setup in which there's only logical stuff there, right? It's just two buttons, two perfectly logical sentences, just perfectly logical through and through. So it's highly dualistic in that it's excluding any illogical stuff, and yet it breeds all sorts of illogical stuff. Therefore, it is still perfectly non-dualistic and all-inclusive. of all sorts of stuff, which is both logical and illogical, right? So again, this is why I've stated in past videos, don't be afraid of duality, right? Non-duality, it's so all-inclusive that it doesn't even need to exist in order to be itself. You could have a purely dualistic reality, such as one that is purely classically logical, and still you could have non-duality, even within that reality in which there's no non-duality. So non-duality is so selfless, it's so detached from itself, that it can exist even if it itself does not exist. It can be there even in a reality in which it's not there. A purely dualistic, purely rationalized reality, which has no room for non-duality at all, no room for 2 + 2 = 5, no room for square circles, no room for any non-dualities or contradictions. Even though there's no room, it can still be there. It can literally be there without being there. So don't become attached to non-duality. Non-duality is so expansive and so contractive that it can be there even without being there. So don't commit to it. Don't cling to it. You don't need to cling to it. Non-duality doesn't even cling to itself. Doesn't even cling to itself. It doesn't care if reality is dualistic or not. It doesn't care if reality is purely logical or not. It doesn't care if 2 + 2 = 5 is impossible. It's still going to be there, right? Okay, but see, this whole example of restricting reality to classical logic, this all makes sense so far, or at least hopefully it does. It's still kind of hairy and confusing, but hopefully it makes some sense. And that's why I've taught this before, because it does make some sense. But there are other things I could talk about or other examples I could teach which would not make any sense to teach because they're actually very difficult to communicate. I'm not even sure how I would communicate them because there's not really any clear examples I could use, whereas with the example of classical logic and the liar's paradox and the 2 buttons and 2 sentences side by side, those are clear examples I can teach you to show how reality can be unlimited even if it's purely logical, right? It can be unlimited not just despite the fact that it's purely logical, but even because of the fact that it's purely logical. It would be because of the very setup that all sorts of unlimited stuff would come out of that. So that makes sense to teach. There's all sorts of examples for it, like the liar's paradox and those 2 buttons. But here's some stuff that I haven't talked about before because there aren't really any good examples I can bring up for it. I actually have to find ways to really articulate this stuff. But if reality can include anything and everything and be completely unlimited, even if it's purely classically logical, it can also go further. It can be even more contractive than that. Picture if reality only included the color green. That's all that exists. There's no other colors. There's not even anything else. There's no sounds. There's no sights. There's no emotions. There's no objects. There's not even any experiences, which of course that would probably not make sense, right? Like how could there be green without any experience of green? So yeah, this isn't going to make any sense, but just try and picture it. Picture if reality only included the color green, no experiences of anything else. No experiences of anything, not even experiences of the color green. Okay, what I'm saying is that reality is so contractive and so highly efficient that even if it were fixed to this narrow of a program, it could still be unlimited and still include anything and everything. It just includes green, and yet it still includes anything and everything. So it's like green equals anything and everything, even though it's just green. So see, this is a more contractive example than the classical logic example. With the classical logic example, it's easier for you to maybe visualize how reality could be logical and yet still be unlimited, not just despite it being logical, but because of all the logical setups, right? We can get logical setups which breed infinitude. So it's easy to picture how classical logic could fix reality to itself and yet unlimit it and unconstrain it at the same time. But with this example of greenness being the only thing that exists, this is harder to come up with examples for me to articulate to you how this could be the case. But really, all you need to understand is that it's just something where if you were to take the classical logic example and make it even more contractive, you would eventually reach this even narrower framework in which there's just green and yet reality is still unlimited. But you could go further. I mean, you could even contract reality all the way to the point example, which I discussed back at the beginning of this video and in past videos. You could just have reality being that puny point. It's really not even there. And yet within that point, you have anything and everything, because the point can be any shape, it can be any number, even zero or negative numbers. So reality can be that contractive and that expansive. So people often think, okay, how expansive is reality? How much does it include? And that's typically what I talk about here on this channel. But what we're going over here is how contractive can it be? Really try to think about that. How contractive can it be? How much can it exclude and yet include at the same time, even while it's being exclusive or dualistic? All right, how non-dualistic and all-inclusive could it be, even if it's being highly exclusive, highly dualistic, and highly distinctive? You'd have all these dualistic distinctions existing, and yet it'd still somehow be all-inclusive and boundless and non-dualistic, such that just green exists or just classical logic exists. There's no square circles, there's no 2 + 2 equaling anything other than 4, and yet you have anything and everything. No contradictions, and yet you're still highly unlimited. Another example, which might be a little easier for you to visualize, is picture if reality were just three-dimensional. So there were no other dimensions, no two-dimensional realities, no one-dimensional realities, or four-dimensional or five-dimensional. Like literally 3 dimensions of space-time is all that exists. How could reality be unlimited if it's just three-dimensional? Well, picture if it had infinitely many three-dimensional shapes. Okay, well, infinity is boundless, so if it's truly boundless such that we have a truly boundless number of three-dimensional shapes, we're going to get any and every type of shape within that set of shapes. So somewhere in that set of shapes, you would think we would start getting four-dimensional shapes. So this is where it's going to get confusing again, is we just have 3 dimensions. So reality is just three-dimensional, and it has infinitely many three-dimensional shapes, but because there's a boundless number of these three-dimensional shapes, eventually the shapes are going to start to twist and contort into like things that are reminiscent of four-dimensional shapes or two-dimensional shapes or one-dimensional shapes. So it's like even if you're constraining yourself to having infinitely many three-dimensional shapes, eventually the shapes are still going to start presenting patterns which make them four-dimensional or one-dimensional or two-dimensional. So it's like even if reality were three-dimensional, you could get all the dimensions existing in those 3 dimensions. I'm going to articulate that better in the future because that's not really, at least I think, good enough for you to maybe quite understand what I'm getting at. That's still going to sound kind of confusing. But yeah, reality can be fixed to 3 dimensions and yet still be unlimited and include all the other dimensional stuff within it. In this way, reality could be any arbitrary number of dimensions. It could be 6-dimensional and still include anything and everything, being perfectly unlimited, having everything being true, satisfying all beliefs of all religions or ideas, etc. This is why I used to have a 6-dimensional model of reality that I actually used to take quite seriously. I don't anymore. I've dialed in more on reality now with my condition. I don't really think it's 6-dimensional, but nevertheless, even if it were, what I'm saying is like it could be 6-dimensional and yet still include anything and everything to a limitless degree, such that anything and everything is true, anything and everything is false, both true and false, neither true nor false, just like any and every idea or belief system, just like anything could be true, even within this narrow six-dimensional model. Even if this narrow six-dimensional model were to have like a specific color or something like that, again, think back to the example with reality just being green. So reality can be highly narrow and yet still be unconstrained and include everything totally. That's how it can be dualistic and still be non-dualistic, right? It can be non-dualistic even without being non-dualistic. So you don't even need non-duality in order to have non-duality. And this is just talking about how contractive reality could be if it's in any way reflective of my condition. But it's not just that reality could be highly expansive or highly contractive. It could also be high in a degree of all sorts of other metrics. So like expansiveness is just one metric, contractiveness is another metric. That's just two metrics. There's all sorts of other metrics that could exist. There could be a third metric besides expansiveness or contractiveness, or a fourth or a fifth, etc. And notice, even the fact that we're building up all these other metrics, that in of itself is highlighting the expansiveness of reality. We could then highlight the contractiveness of reality with regards to how many of these other metrics there could be. So there could be just the expansiveness metric, and reality could still be unlimited. Or there could be just the contractiveness metric, and reality could still be unlimited. Or any third metric, there could be just that one alone, excluding all the others, and despite excluding all the others, reality would still be all-inclusive and unlimited. So you see, we could start layering these metrics on top of each other. We could talk about having all these metrics in terms of the expansiveness of them, but see, expansiveness is itself one of the metrics, so we're looking through that metric of expansiveness at all the other metrics. We could then look through the metric of contractiveness in terms of how we look at all the other metrics, right? We can contract all the other metrics, how many there are. We can expand on them and build up more metrics. So we could use all the other metrics to organize all the other metrics, right? We could use the expansiveness metric to organize how many there are, use the contractiveness one to organize how few there are, use a third metric to organize all the other metrics. So we could start layering the metrics by using each metric to organize all the other metrics. You see that? So we could do all that. Or none of it. We could do none of that, and reality would still be unlimited. So see, we could just keep layering with each of these metrics. Hopefully that makes sense. Again, I imagine the logic stuff, I mean, I've gone over that before. I've talked before about how reality can be purely logical and yet unlimited, you know, sort of have logic as a delimiter rather than a limiter. So all of you guys, or at least most of you, are used to that by now. So that was probably a little easier to understand. Whereas the stuff with, you know, the dimensions and the colors and all those limiters and types of contractiveness, maybe that was a little bit trickier, but I'd be happy to answer any questions if you have them. I can also discuss this more in the future, as well as some of the other metrics, right, besides just the expansive metric and the contractive metric. But let me know if there's anything else you'd like me to discuss. If not, I'll see you all next time. Create a nice day.